Now, in this podcast, I just want to give a quick overview. I'm going to have you watch some documentaries, but on the Western Front, after Overlord, as I talked about last week, it took the Allies about 6 to 8 weeks to break out of Normandy, which they finally did. Captured Paris in August of 1944. But the most difficult fighting for the Americans in Europe happened between September or so of 1944 and the end of the war. So the big picture point that I want you to take as students of World War II is to disabuse yourself of the notion that somehow D-Day marked the end of World War II. So D-Day happens on June 6th, the Operation Overlord, the invasion of northern France, which the U.S. had been pushing for really since 1942. It happens in June of 1944, but the Germans don't surrender until April of 1945. So there's still, 10 months of fighting left after D-Day, and especially very iconic battles such as the Battle of the Bulge, which was the bloodiest fight that the Americans faced in Europe. That was all in the future. The Battle of the Bulge, and I'm going to have you watch a documentary on that. That happens around Christmas time and New Year's of 1944. So still very, very tough fighting on the Western Front. All the way until April of 1945. So D-Day doesn't mark the end of the war. It's a very important step in the end of the war, getting Allied troops in France, creating that second front that Stalin had insisted on. There were 50 German divisions in Western Europe, a very, very significant number. For instance, Army Group Center, the one that was totally smashed during Operation Bagration, it was 38 division infantry. So Hitler, there were a lot of German troops in the West. And creating that second front, Overlord, was incredibly important. There's no doubt about that. But the war tragically is not over after D-Day. There's a lot of tough fighting ahead, both before and after the liberation of Paris. Now, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets smash Army Group Center with Operation Bagration. And hopefully you watched the documentary on that I posted. But then what happens is the Soviets pour into Eastern Europe. They pour into the Romania, the eastern parts of Poland, and I'm going to talk about in a podcast that comes after this podcast. There are going to be tremendous political fights about the fate of Eastern Europe in the post-war period. But the reality is the Soviets got there first, and they had boots on the ground, tragically, for the people of Eastern Europe. So the most notorious of the incidents that happens as the Soviets move into Eastern Europe was their inability, or I think a better word is refusal, to involve Soviet armies in the uprising in Warsaw, which occurred in early August of 1944. So what you had was the Soviet army was approaching Warsaw. Warsaw was not an easy city to attack. Cities, as the Germans found out in Stalingrad, are full of strong defensive positions. But as the Soviets moved towards Warsaw, there was a feeling among the folks that still lived in Warsaw that an uprising would force the Germans out and would end the occupation of Warsaw, Poland quickly. But the uprising in Warsaw turned out to be a major mistake. And the reason for this is the Soviet Union, for many reasons, was very reluctant to get involved in the Warsaw Uprising. In a sympathetic account of the Soviets' refusal / inability to get involved with the uprising focuses on the fact that the Soviet army was very spread out. It couldn't focus a number of its troops on Warsaw. Also, Stalin wanted to move carefully. There was no hurry from his point of view to liberate Warsaw. He knew he knew at some point Warsaw was going to fall because the Germans were retreating towards their homeland, towards the fatherland, and he knew that he didn't have to plunge headlong into Warsaw. That eventually Soviet troops would capture it. But the problem also was that the Soviets were reluctant to get involved in Warsaw because they wanted the Germans to kill a number of potential Soviet enemies in Warsaw. And so there doesn't seem to be any shadow of a doubt that Stalin used the Warsaw Uprising as a chance to have the Germans kill his enemies, because a lot of the people that were fighting against the Germans in Warsaw were Polish patriots that, had the Soviets come in and taken over Warsaw, these same Poles would have turned against the Russians as well. So, so this is one of the reasons that Stalin also orders his armies just to step back and let the fighting occur. Now, Churchill tries to allow Stalin, or persuade Stalin, to allow the British and the Americans to drop supplies into Warsaw, but Stalin, being the bastard that he is, refuses. And this is what Stalin says. He says, I think the information, this is August 4th, I think the information given to you by the Poles is greatly exaggerated and unreliable. The Home Army, that's part of the Warsaw Uprising, consists of only a few detachments and misnamed divisions. They don't have guns, aircraft, or tanks. I can't imagine them winning this uprising, or you being able to supply them with enough ammunition so that they could win the uprising, and supplying the ammunition by air. So in other words, Stalin doesn't let the Americans or the British resupply the Soviet uprising. Stalin refuses to let the American and British airplanes even to land on territory that's controlled by the Soviet Union, which they easily could have done. And this is the first time, this is August of 44, where the Americans, and I'm going to talk about this in the following podcast, the Americans and the British begin to realize that Stalin has every intention of taking over Poland after the defeat of Germany, and even before the defeat of Germany. So Stalin doesn't lift a finger to help the folks, the Poles that are fighting the Germans in Warsaw, beginning in August of 1944. Not only that, he refuses to allow British and U.S. bombers, or not bombers, aircraft, to drop supplies into Warsaw to help those fighting in the uprising against the Nazis. Not only that, he doesn't allow he doesn't allow U.S. or British aircraft to even land in the territory controlled by the Soviet Union, which would have made logistically the dropping of supplies a lot easier. And there was an attempt by the British and the Americans to drop some food, ammunition, and grenades, but only about half of the supplies reached the insurgents because it just turned out to be a very inefficient way of resupplying. And the Soviet, we can't send troops into Warsaw because Warsaw is surrounded by Soviet troops. Ultimately, the Warsaw Uprising was a catastrophe. It was suppressed ruthlessly by the Nazis. 150,000 civilians were killed during the Warsaw Uprising, murdered in many cases, 150,000. 200,000 home guard, i.e. the Polish forces fighting the Nazis as well. And, these are folks that Stalin was just as happy to see killed. And we know how ruthless Stalin is. The Germans lost 10,000 men. So again, 150,000 killed in August and September as the uprising in Warsaw fails. 200,000 home army casualties, Polish troops that were fighting, that had been in Warsaw that were fighting against the Nazis, and about 10,000 Germans. The fighting stopped in October, and later that fall, the Germans left Warsaw, and the Soviet army came into Warsaw, devastated Warsaw later that fall.